I will let you know anyway. It will inform me. And
got a message, yeah.
We are already online. So hello everybody, and thank you for joining us one more time. And today we can just continue the series of lectures devoted to the project Bordering, Debordering, Rebordering. And first of all, I want to thank the Embassy of the United States in Ukraine for supporting this project, which is really important considering our current situation. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and everyone who will watch the video afterwards, because we will share the recording, and as a rule, people watch the videos a bit later. So just a small remark for those who are watching us online on Facebook or here who are with us in Zoom. If you have any questions or any remarks you want to share, you're welcome, and you can do it under the video and leave your comments. And our today's speaker will be able to answer these questions in the end of the lecture at the answering. And okay, so just a few words about our today's speaker. I want to introduce you Yeva Nossum, who is a graded translator for German, English, and Italian. And she's the scientific coordinator of the UNIGER Center for Border Studies at Saarland University. As you've probably noticed, all our speakers from Germany are somehow connected with Saarland University, and we thank them for the partnership and for, first of all, for taking part in this project. And also, Yeva is the coordinator of the Triangular Border Glossary, a collection of key concepts in the field of border studies, and the editor of Border Languaging, a volume focusing on multilingual practices on the border. She's also an instructor in English linguistics at Saarland University, and I think we can continue speaking about Yeva a lot and a lot, but I would prefer her to speak for herself. And that's why, Yeva, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us and sharing your ideas and your work. So let us probably start the lecture, and we will discuss all the issues afterwards. Thank you, Yeva. You're welcome. So we can start sharing the presentation, I guess.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. Give me a second. Let's see if I can share.
Well, I can see this, the full screen slide. Yeah.
Good. Then hopefully everything should be working. I guess so. Yeah, thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you very much to Ukrainian Fulbright Circle for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor for me of being part of, to be part of this lecture series. And I'm always very happy to speak of course, the research topics that I'm most interested in. And that's a wonderful occasion here, because you allow me here to, as I promised, let's see if I manage to hold that promise, to stake out the field of border linguistics. So let's talk about languages and borders. To wrap this all, or to insert it into a bigger picture, please remind me of the past lectures, and also of an upcoming lecture that you'll still have. I framed it all as border studies from a cultural perspective. You have already had the chance also to talk to listen to the presentations and talk to my colleagues who presented, Isis Luxemburger, Tobias Schank, and Bärbel Schlimbach. And what they all presented, all is part of the very, very broad field of border studies, which I'd say is a great playground, a good field to bring together cultural and also linguistic, and as well spatially oriented research. So let's say spatially oriented perspectives in the humanities, or also humanities-driven research in spatial sciences. People also talk about the spatial turn in the humanities, and also a linguistic and a cultural turn in spatial sciences. So in the last weeks, you already had a few presentations, and there's still one coming up by Professor Astrid Fellner. And today it's my turn, and it will be my pleasure to focus on linguistics and its point of contact in border studies. Or maybe I should say to focus on border studies within the field of linguistics. Let's say, very generally speaking, I'd like to open up the entire field for you and to very broadly have a look at all kinds of questions which somehow link language to the border or border to language. Let's see. You heard already a brief introduction who I am, but more importantly, where I'm located. I'm speaking to you here from the UniGA Center for Border Studies at Saarland University, which is located not too far from Schengen. You might know that place. And you see here on the map of Western Europe, you see a tiny light blue shape that is Saarland, and that's why my university is located. And you see our university network, the UniGA Center for Border Studies, which stretches across 4 countries in Europe, which is Germany, consisting of Saarland and Rhineland-Palatinate, Luxembourg, Belgium, which is only light gray here, can be seen, and France. We have 3 working languages, English, German, and French, and we have collected a bunch of people all with a shared interest in border studies. This is what brings us together, and we formed a center here. So this is the location from which here I am talking to you, I'm speaking to you. And yeah, you see already where I live here and work here in this multilingual surrounding. And this is, I guess, what also leads to the topic which I picked today, languages and borders. So the question is, how can you study language and border, or languages and borders somehow together? This is where I'd like to start. So which contact points do you find between language and border? How can you approach border and language scientifically in an academic context, let's say? How can you study languages and borders? Where and how do borders and languages get into contact? And how can we put the two into relation? So if you give it some idea, I don't know if you have come up, if you might come up with the same ideas as I do. So I'd say we might find, well, it's more or less an exercise in prepositions here. You'll see it might become a question of languages on the border, or languages maybe across the border. How do you speak about the border? What languages can you find or do exist at the border? Or what happens to language at the border or on the border? What happens to languages when it crosses a border? How do languages move across borders? Or the other way around? How is the border realized in language? How do you talk about the border? How do you call it? What name do you give it? And with which words do you phrase border issues? And all of this, and all the related, let's say, theoretical questions around it. So that's the field for today. This is what I what I like to share my thoughts with you. And in order to somehow split this cloud here up, or to make it a little bit more graspable, I try to separate it into 3 main fields. Let's see if that works. One of them is border in language, as you say, or language about border. How do you speak about the border? How is the border negotiated in language? I could ask, what does the border mean to you? Let's think maybe of migrants crossing the Americas, going to the United States in hope of a better future. They cross the entire continent with the idea of border in mind. What does border mean for them? Maybe it's a gateway to a better life. Maybe it's a gateway of hope. One example. What if all talking about the border is about a beautiful wall? The border is seen as a security hazard. That's a different idea of a border. What if we here in Saarbrücken speak about our situatedness on the border with France? Then it's not about security issues, but it highlights our proximity, our friendship, and our close relations, our special ties with France. What if Ukraine now talks about borders, it might refer to the internationally recognized territorial boundary line, which are now violated in the war. It might refer to the front line. So you see, many different things what border can actually mean, or what we can imagine by border. The second big chapter, let's say, is language at or on the border. How do you speak on the border when living on the border? Let's say very roughly, all kind of linguistic practices on the border. So we might ask, do any particular linguistic practices come out of the border? How do people speak in borderlands? Are there any specific linguistic cross-border repertoires, we might ask? What about language acquisition in border regions? I can drop here some keywords like code switching, multilingualism, also questions of language barriers and linguistic boundaries, and so on. And then I'd like to invite you also to have a look at a third big chapter, which, for lack of better words, better ideas, I'd like to present here as theory, let's say, theoretical approaches in linguistics and in border studies. So maybe theoretical border linguistics, or theoretical ideas about or of linguistic border studies. So the question here is, how can the relation of languages and borders be thought? What can we learn about languages coming from the border? Or how can we understand borders coming from a language-centered perspective when focusing on questions of language? So that might be pretty abstract now, and this is why in the following, I'd like to give some examples for these different fields, which I'm trying to separate here. And then afterwards also to zoom in more detail into this theoretical field. So let's see. So the first big chunk, I said, how do we speak about the border? What happens to the border in language? So the field border in language. The development and the extension of this field, I'd say, it has been constantly growing. It's caused by an extension and I'd say a diversification of border studies as an inter and transdisciplinary field of study. Border studies is characterized by an increasing complexity of border questions or border issues. See that in academia and also outside of academia. So as that field grows, so does the language about borders. Let's take here our very specific context here. The more the field becomes broader, the bigger also becomes the need to clarify the understanding of the own field, especially in the case of inter and transdisciplinary research fields such as border studies. So the question, what name do you have for the border? What do you understand by border? English border, or maybe boundary, maybe frontier, French frontière, German Grenze. What is it in Ukrainian? Do you say cordon? Do you say muja? Do you say limit? Do some of you say granica? Many words for that. Now, when using, for example, cordon, do you speak about the internationally recognized boundary line? Or do you speak about the front line? And, or maybe about the border to the currently occupied territories on Ukrainian soil? That's one side. And how do you speak about the border? Do all these concepts mean then the same thing? Do I think the same thing? Do I intend the same when I think of border and you think of cordon? And in a broader sense, it's not only about the term itself, it's also about the field of study that's attached to it. Is border studies, is it the same as Grenzforschung in German or Études sur les frontières in French? Or is it the same as boundary studies? Is it the same as borderland studies? So the question arises here in academia very quickly, which vocabulary, which specialized terminology do researchers use in the field of border studies? or grenzwurzel? Or are there differences? This all goes along, or is the proliferation of concepts goes hand in hand, of course, with the always changing understanding of the border. And let me see here. I've tried to collect a few strands, a few directions in which all these developments go. We can start with very early understandings of the border as a separating line, or as some phrase it, a line drawn in the sand. So this is very much the structure, the focus on a boundary line, on a dividing line that separates one side from the other. Then very quickly also perspectives emerged that focused not only on the divisive aspect of the border, but saw this line also as a kind of suture. So somehow knitting together two sides. The perspective then again changed and broadened up from a line to a space, a borderland, the borderlands also. And with that followed then stronger social focus and focus on practices. How do people do the border? What practices are part of, or what practices does the border consist of, so to speak? And there hand in hand goes a shift away from border to bordering as a verb, so something that is in continuous repetition and which is always reproduced. All that again then leads to a new way of thinking about borders. All kind of new epistemologies have emerged. For example, border thinking by Walter Migliolo, border as method by Mezzada and Nielsen, Chris Rumford phrased it as seen like the border. All these are theoretical approaches, ways of thinking the border in a certain way. And also in our working group here, we work on border textures or border texturing, which again is also a way of thinking the border, a way of a perspective on the border that also brings with it a certain research perspective, we say. So all this proliferation of terms, concepts, ideas, developments, there clearly seems to be a certain need for clarification. Let's say, what notion of the border do you work with in border studies? So we can say, how can we then in border studies make sure we understand each other? How can we make sure we actually mean the same thing? So the field, as I said, has been growing, and it keeps growing to the point that recently in 2019, even a group of geographers, well, who usually focus, of course, on other questions, they felt the need for a clarification and felt the urge of addressing the issue of the border and border studies in language. I say even because usually, of course, their focus on research lies elsewhere. But here, Conrad, Leine, Likan, Scott, and Widdis ask how do we speak and write about borders? Can we understand how language of borders emerged? They look for border vocabularies, border words, a border lexicon. So you see they almost exclusively focus on the lexical level, the level of words. They express a clear, or let's say a first attempt to do some terminology work in the field of border studies. So that was in 2019. And look here, more or less at the same time, also we in our UNHCR Center for Border Studies have made similar observations. We also found the proliferation of terms and concepts, well, to a certain extent also confusing. And we've been struggling with the same issues. Some years before, we already realized the huge need for terminology work, not only in border studies, excuse me. Excuse me. So we noticed here that's a huge need for terminology work in border studies in the English-speaking world and also beyond. So also in our area here in the greater region. As I said, in our Center for Border Studies, we have 3 official working languages, German, English, and French. And this is why we started doing terminology work already in 2018. And our plan here was that since 2018, we've been working on the creation of a trilingual, multimodal, and interdisciplinary glossary of border studies. That glossary will be freely accessible to all interested parties on our website, on the website of the Center for Border Studies. And very, very soon, now finally, I want to say, the first entries will go live and will be available online. All the contributions that you can find here are drafted by colleagues from within our Center for Border Studies. And we assign them the task of defining one key concept in their respective border studies. That is, how they define and use it in their research and teaching, and to write this up in the form of a long encyclopedic article, like an academic paper. So that was the task that we've given them. And so far, we've collected here quite a few concepts, entries, encyclopedic entries, which we'd say are then the key concepts of researchers in our Center for Border Studies, as explained from the respective disciplinary perspective of the contributors. So this way, we want to spin the network of the most important key concepts of border studies as they are used by our different partners, coming from their respective disciplinary background. So I can offer you a first glimpse into the glossary. So let me show you some entries so it becomes more clear what we're doing here in this project, but just on an exemplary basis here. For example, we have one entry on border as method. I already mentioned that as a conceptual development. Fellner and Canesu drafted this entry together and explain Metzadra and Nielsen's concept of border as method. They say understanding border as method entails adopting a research position which follows the logic of the border and treats the border as an epistemological position, which gives rise to border thinking, and so on and so on and so on. An entire article about that. Keyword border thinking. We also have an entry for border thinking. So the concept of border thinking, again, Fellner and Canesu, the same authors, describes a way of thinking which is deeply rooted in the subaltern perspective, and subaltern experience of coloniality and the borderlands, while at the same time freeing thought processes from colonial modern epistemologies, and so on. So that's another example for an entry. We also have an entry for borderscapes, a concept not coined, but worked a lot on by Brambilla. Borderscapes relate to practices, norms, and ethics of bordering, performance, struggle, the ever-changing fluid dimension of border spaces, and so on. And we'll have, of course, also an entry for border textures, our very own conceptual development that we are working on. It is here explained as a the geopolitical border itself stops being a suture sewing together two different distinct national fabrics. It becomes a texture and follows along explanation. So this all will be available very, very soon online. We're just working on the finishing touches, so then we'll have it in German, in English, and in French. It will be freely accessible. So all of that, lots of ideas, lots of content about the border in language. I'd also like to have a look together with you at questions of language at and across the border. So the next big field of study of language and borders. So naming the question of languages at and across the border, let's have a look at some examples also here on how language is used at the border, how language is used across the border, and I'd say on what happens with languages at the border. So in order to do that, I first would like to introduce you to one of the texts which laid the basis for the field of cultural border studies. I guess my colleagues who've spoken already in this series have mentioned it, and I'm very sure that you'll hear more about this book in Professor Fellner's lecture, What is Border Writing, which is upcoming soon. So I'm talking, of course, about the fundamental key text in cultural border studies, namely Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldúa from 1987. We can introduce the book itself as a border text, a text which crosses borders itself. Indeed, borders of different kind. So it comes out of the US-Mexican borderlands. It is about border crossing persons and about a border which had in fact crossed people. As they say, we did not cross the border crossed us. But the book itself is also a border crosser, as it defies and crosses borders or boundaries of genre. It can be considered a literary text, even a poetic text, but also an academic, a scientific publication. It mixes historical sources with myths and legends. It expands them thanks to poetic license. It included poetic moments, it tackles border issues, and it negotiates questions of identity. Of particular interest for us today, of course, is Anzaldúa's use of language in this book. This is, I'd say, where cultural border studies and linguistic border studies come together. Anzaldúa mixes languages, as you can already see here in the title, Borderlands La Frontera. She mixes English and Spanish. In the book, she also includes elements of Nahuatl and other indigenous languages, cultures, and traditions. She jumps back and forth between all these elements. You might say, is the book difficult to read? Do you need to know all these languages to be able to understand the book? Well, I invite you to try it out for yourself. It's really worth a read, and I don't want to promise too much. I share a quote with you or two. Namely, indeed, not only does Anzaldúa cross and mix languages constantly in her book, she even picks up and explicitly explains her language use. She says, I quote, "Pocho, cultural traitor, you're speaking the oppressor's language by speaking English. You're ruining the Spanish language. I've been accused by various Latinas. Chicano Spanish is considered by the purist and by most deficient, a mutilation of Spanish. But Chicano Spanish is a border tongue, which has developed naturally." And so on. She goes further and explains a language which they can connect their identity to, that is Chicano English or Chicano Spanish. One capable of communicating the realities and values true to themselves. And here she says, a language with terms that are neither Espanol nor Inglés, but both. So that's very interesting. So I promise to keep that part here short. And let's now move to the third big field. So I managed to rush you through this entire field. The one of the theoretical approach to language and borders. That is the development of theoretical linguistic border studies, which will provide us with tools and new perspectives with which we can analyze the practical, the applied examples. So here comes part 3, theory on language and borders, or linguistics and border studies. Let's see. First of all, we can raise the question, which kind of linguistics or which branch of linguistics could fit best to border studies? Which one lends itself best for bringing it together with border studies? Applied or theoretical linguistics? I mean, by the way, I mean here theoretical, not in the sense of a formal linguistics, not system-oriented, not the level which Saussure called langue, but rather a theoretical approach, let's say, to research areas in the field of applied linguistics. And with applied linguistics, I do not mean the limited focus on didactics and second or foreign language acquisition, but let's understand it in a very broad sense, encompassing contact linguistics, language contact, multilingualism, language learning, language acquisition, translation, all kinds of linguistic practices. So then, if we don't focus on language as a system, but on language use and the language user, let's move that to the center. And that goes hand in hand then with shifting in the consideration and understanding of language as an abstract construct, as code or as language, that shift goes away towards languaging, to a processual language use. So language as a practice. Becker has that move already in 1995, from language to languaging. So language not as something that simply is somewhere out there, but that's something that you do. So in order to stake out the field, as I promised, I'd like to have a look together with you at some publications that can be found out there. And let me first take you on a short time travel. Let me give you a brief overview of the existing work in the field, which I'd like to sum up under the roof of linguistic border studies, though of course it was not called such when the text came out. We met already the great Gloria Anzaldúa. Remember, it was then 1987 when her groundbreaking book came out, and not that much time after this field here, I'd say the first steps can be traced back again to the US-Mexico border, where in the 1990s, the very first work has been created, which I'd like to classify explicitly as linguistic border studies. I'd say it's Alfred Arteaga's Anne of the Tongue, Nation and Ethnicity in Linguistic Borderlands. You see it here on the slide. This book here mainly focuses on questions of identity and hybridity and their manifestation, their realization in linguistic practices in the US-Mexican borderlands. It contains mainly social linguistic analysis, and I'd like to invite you to consider this text maybe as one of the foundational texts of linguistic border studies, as it picks up issues of linguistic construction of identity, as was typical in the 1990s, and links these identity questions to the border, to borderlands. So we make a huge leap forward and end up already in 2014, in more recent times here, 20 years or more after, no more, after Arteaga, 30 years after Arteaga, actually. Questions of identity in relation to language and borders are still being examined, as this publication by Watt and Llamas in 2014 shows. Also in this case here, it's an edited collection with contributions which focus mostly on social linguistic perspectives on the construction of identities and borders. Next one. Again, 2014, the first thematic issue of a linguistic journal came out, which entirely focused on languages and borders, namely the 227th edition of the International Journal of the Sociology of Language, entitled Languages and Borders, edited by Glenn Martinez. As the title already gives away, here again, the focus is mostly on social linguistic questions, as in the article, I quote, towards the social linguistics of the border, but also questions of language and globalization, of language ideologies, of linguistic landscapes, and of multilingualism are addressed. Let's move on. As you can see, 2014 was a very productive year for linguistic border studies. In the very same year, Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei published their book, Translanguaging. It's an entire book dedicated to the topic of translanguaging. The book consists of two parts, namely part 2, Translanguaging as a didactic practice in language learning and teaching, and part 1, which is more important here, I'd argue, for our theoretical developments here, a theory of multilingualism, if I may call it such for simplicity's sake here. What is important here to remember is that this book here, this publication by these two authors, is for the first time, is not an edited collection of different smaller essays, but a real book, let's say, a monograph, which we can take as a clear indicator for the rise in research activities in the field of linguistic border studies. 2 years after, in 2016, a new monograph saw the light of the day, which I'd also like to attribute to the field of linguistic border studies, and that's David Gramling's The Invention of Monolingualism. In this book, Gramling criticizes the long prevailing paradigm of an idealized monolingualism, as it has been propagated in the dominant Wild West, and as it clearly shows, especially in Europe, its strong policy of national languages. Also, in Ukraine, I'd say this is a hotly discussed debate. As you all know, I'd love to learn more about that afterwards. Gramling shifts the view on border situations and situations of multilingualism and highlights its status as a norm. And contrary to what was proclaimed in older linguistic norms, which elevate a white cis male monolingual speaker as the norm, Gramling shows that indeed it is multilingualism which is the norm, and that monolingualism, at least in a very strict sense, does not really exist, but that it has only been created as a construct of linguistic policies. So I'd say Gramling's book makes this a fundamental contribution to linguistic border studies, and it offers the important shift away from the dominant center towards the subaltern, to the other, to the margin, to the border, we can say. It was thus successful that Gramling now, 2 years ago, came up, let's say, with a kind of second edition. No, not really, but clearly you can see like a follow-up work, the second monograph, The Invention of Multilingualism. Let me speed up a little bit. And again, in recent times here, 2 years after the first book by Gramling, Horner and Daly O'Kane published another book which also focuses on multilingualism and which links these questions with issues of mobility, thus explicitly integrating questions of space into debates on multilingualism. As such, also this edited collection makes it to our first bibliography of linguistic border studies. Well, of course, there are many, many more works, and we could put forward many more books and surely articles. And of course, the small selection which I've offered here is exclusively made on the basis of my specific criteria and from my disciplinary perspective and from my interest. I hope that in close future, the list will get longer and longer. Many new exciting books will see the light of the day. Please allow me very briefly to also hint at a publication that is coming up, where I'm working on. So allow me this little bit of advertisement here because it's fitting to the topic. So I'm working on an edited collection under the title of Border Languaging right now, in which we also have the aim of bundle some space-based approaches in linguistics to focus on linguistic dynamics of demarcation and to include perspectives like keywords here. Multilingualism from below is a research perspective that is very strong in that book. And the book Border Languaging aims at offering a critique of, and I'd say that's important, of the conflation of language and territory, or language and nation, as it is very often the case, especially in, let's say, old Europe. The border is to be regarded as a translanguaging space. We focus on spatial repertoires, life trajectories, and whatnot. And the aim is to challenge Western ideologies of monolingualism and separate plurilingualism, and importantly, to develop the notion of border languaging by introducing the contested spatiality of the border to our analysis of multilingual language practices. So, let me sum up. We heard that I tried to give you here an overview of what I have encountered and how I could sketch out the field of linguistic border studies. What we have observed, of course, is a very strong research production coming out of the US context, a very strong focus then also on hybridity in the US-Mexican borderlands. Remember, Ansaldúa said also, the Ansaldúa quote where she says she's referred to as a traitor, pocho, because she uses the language of the oppressor, as the quote says. I might link that to some ideas, questions, whatever, to the discussion that hopefully can follow or can also follow afterwards. I'd be happy to get in contact with people who work on these questions. This question here, of course, of being accused of using the language of the oppressor, one cannot not notice or compare it somehow to the language situation in Ukraine today. the use of language of the oppressor. There's a big discussion, of course, or accusation also to Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Language has been weaponized so much in the war in Ukraine. Russia used language as a pretext also for initiating the war. So there's a lot of language politics going on. So that's a very, very difficult topic, and we see that it's clearly moving away from analytical work that also that our field has to offer so far. So I really like to get into an exchange with people here. How can we make sense of that situation? We see many former Russian speakers in Ukraine drop Russian now, stronger focus on Ukrainian language. Will that somehow lead to, I don't know, a stronger invisibility of multilingual realities in Ukraine? I mean, there's far more languages in Ukraine, we know. Also very interesting, what will happen to Surzhyk? I mean, is that like a translingual practice still? Did that ever have a potential to form an own identity, as Ansaldua's case with Spanglish, or rather not? Is it just a legacy of a colonial language that'll die out now? I don't know. So there's many difficult questions and fields where I'd like to learn much more about all these connections of language to space, not to be conflated with language and territory or language and nations, I'd say. But all these examples have hopefully shown the power of language on the border, the power of language across the border, the power to violate borders on the justification of language policies. On the other hand, also linguistic means of protecting borders and so on. So I'd like to stop here because I guess this is my overview, which is again, of course, work in progress. It's a growing field. And I already said that I hope that I can get in contact here with people who work on these questions so I can learn more and broaden my perspective and include all kind of observations and analysis also from the Ukrainian context, which I'd be really interested to in learning more about. Okay, thank you very much. I stopped sharing my slides and I'm available for comments and questions.
Well, first of all, thank you, Yava. And as far as I can see from the comments on Facebook, our viewers still do not have any questions. Probably they need some time. But I've received a lot of messages on my Facebook and other systems, social media. So all the viewers who I know, they just thank you a lot for the information. And they say that they need some time just to look through it once more.
Yes.
And yeah,
it's a lot. It was a lot. When you open up an entire field, I can only throw a lot of content at you and hope that some people will get something out of it, and then we can engage in a discussion and follow up.
Yeah, and we know some linguists were Fulbright alumni as well, and I'm sure they will come up with the questions or some maybe remarks or ideas a bit later. Yeah. So thanks a lot from all of us, and we also want to thank Germany, as usually, for the huge help we received from your country, and of course the other countries as well. So we appreciate it, and especially in these hard days. I mean, the last week. So yeah, you do a lot for us, and it helps us. Actually, helps a lot.
It could be far more, I think, but yeah. We're with you. That's for sure.
So thank you, and we wish you a nice evening. And I'm sure that the discussion is not over, and we will continue what we've started in this project and all together. So thank you once more, and see you probably sometime later, or at least let's stay in contact. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you
touch.
very much again for having me here as part of that series. It was a great honor and pleasure. And yeah, let's stay in touch. All the best.
Yeah, all the best. Goodbye.
Bye bye.